To our young, it is surprising that the other races of the galaxy do not always join us. The Shadowsun point to our great victories, peerless weaponry, and undefeatable strategies. Our future pilots praise our fleets that pierce the stars and spread knowledge, wisdom, and peace. The young poor speak in mesmerizing tones of the undeniable success experienced by all of our partners, from Kroot to Vespid, Greet to Nikasa. The apprentices of the Earth caste look upon our race's wondrous creations in every field of architecture, mathematics, science, logic, and engineering. How, they ask, could anyone deny us? We have learned, at great cost, that our enemies do not consider these facts. Their minds are clouded by false ideologies that have been failing them for longer than our race has even existed, or they are driven only by base hungers and passions. They see not that the Tau Va raises us above such pettiness, nor sadly do many care. Ethereal Aunlan, in his ineffable wisdom, recognized that no gift is more precious than that of knowing one's place in the universe, and that living and dying for enlightenment and reason are the greatest of all purposes. All of this gives immense freedoms. We Tau all instinctively acknowledge the truth of his words. We all instinctively perceive that sometimes the parent must appear cruel to the child in order for them to learn what is right and be strengthened for the future. We all instinctively comprehend that the ignorant must be guided by the enlightened, and that progress cannot be halted for the benefit of the close-minded. There is a greater good. The greater good is higher than any of us or any other cause. It is what we live, strive, and die for. It is the galaxy's destiny, though it is with sadness that I admit that not all accept it. It is our humble duty to make it reality for all, whether they know they need it or not. No deed in the Tau Va proliferation is an unworthy one. No sacrifice in its dissemination is in vain. We will topple false ideologies, make war into peace, let sadness become joy, and turn ignorance to cognizance, for the greater good. Shas O Shasira, Commander Shadowsun. Psychic Awakening, the greater good. The Tau Empire's fifth sphere expansion has begun in earnest. Reunited with the surviving heroes of the fourth sphere, the Tau work to fulfill their destiny and bring ever more worlds and peoples into the fold of the greater good. These populations may be ignorant of the greatness that could be theirs, but they will be taught. Beset on many sides by dead space or formidable alien empires, many years ago the Tau sought to circumnavigate these obstacles in their quest to unite the galaxy under the greater good. They envisaged this fourth sphere expansion as the greatest of its kind in their history, but it failed, apparently lost with all hands in a technological disaster. Only years later were survivors discovered, and Commander Shadowsun took leadership of the fifth sphere expansion to reunite the Tau Empire with its lost kin. Powering through the Startide Nexus wormhole, Shadowsun's fleet emerged at the Nimya Atoll, in a region known to the Imperium as the Chalath Expanse. Period of intense colonization culminated in a ferocious battle against the Death Guard, but the Tau secured victory, and they are now prepared to strike out again. Humanity's beleaguered soldiery in the Chalath Expanse stand against foe after foe, even with their skies scarred by the Great Rift. Holding on to their faith in the Emperor with all their might, they fight to quell rebellions and uprisings as well as Xenos invasion. Even an armed force as insidious as the Gene Stealer cults cannot count on their complex plans to unfold without difficulty. They are not alone in wanting domination over the planet they call home. Other races and ideologies have designs upon it, not least the Tau and their greater good. The Gene Stealer cults are tenacious and devious, and their claws are dug deep into the Chalath Expanse. They will do what it takes to keep competitors away from their territory, spilling as much blood as possible. The Fifth Sphere Expansion. When a returning recon probe proved that some of the Fourth Sphere's towers still lived, the Fifth Sphere Expansion was founded to reunite the survivors with the Empire. Beyond the Startide Nexus, they met with strange findings and foul foes. Barely a quarter of the Fourth Sphere fleet had escaped the hellish sub-realm that they had been pitched into by the mass failure of their ship's AL-38 slipstream modules. Countless colonists were slain by murderous and sadistic creatures dwelling there that defied all Tau understanding of the universe. Given the horror that they had endured, most of the survivors could barely speak of how they escaped. It surprised many of the Fifth Sphere Tau that what discomforted their lost kin more than anything else was the presence of non-Tau species in the Fifth Sphere fleet. The Fourth Sphere's own auxiliaries could not be found, with only dark theories circulating as to why. Despite the many questions that still hung ominously in the air, Shadowsun wasted little time in progressing the Fifth Sphere expansion. The Nemyar Atoll was wild and contested by myriad races. Piratical orc fleets terrorized the Fulnar Nebula in the east, and scattered Tyranid tendrils roamed hungrily. Several Imperial worlds were swept up quickly by Shadowsun's forces, having been left vulnerable and isolated by the Devourer of Hope, known to humans as the Great Rift. The Fourth Sphere Tau relished war against these humans, carrying out acts of incredible barbarity, such as the slaughter at Salkayo, the Phi Leal Station bloodshed, and many others that haunted Shadowsun and the Ethereal High Council. Such were these atrocities that many commanders of the Fourth Sphere were subjected to the ritual punishment of Malk La. Despite their hindrances, a multitude of colonies were established. Only months after the miraculous reunification with the Fourth Sphere survivors, the Nemyar Atoll came under attack. Without warning, an immense armada of ships resembling hideously changed Imperial vessels broke into real space before the Startide Nexus itself, disgorging torrents of ordnance and boarding torpedoes. The Nexus's defense platforms were buffeted by shot that corroded their crisp armored hull in the blink of an eye. Boarded defenders found themselves under attack from enemies that resembled space marines, but with bodies grotesquely degenerated and beset by foul plagues. Many wielded huge scythes that could cut a crisis battlesuit in twain, or carried weapons that spewed gouts of toxic slime. Despite their hideous deformities, they were terrifyingly resilient, shrugging off withering weapons fire with impunity. For all the surprise of the attack, the Tau forces were highly disciplined, and the defense fleets responded with laudable speed. A great many of the invading ships were destroyed in salvos of heavy fire, but they were remarkably durable. Like the hulking abominations that crewed them, and large numbers more survived. They disgorged thousands of warriors from their heavy bulks who descended upon stellar fortifications and ships with incredible ferocity, spreading their filth with joyous abandon. Broken reports spoke of the Tau themselves being infected by the invaders' disgusting contagions. None could explain how the Tau could be affected by Guayla diseases, and yet they were. Some orbital stations were so ravaged that their captain's last act before succumbing to illness were to set their stations to self-destruct, lest what they suffered spread to others. When Shadowsun learned of the assault, she responded without hesitation. Correlating data from battles on Kelik and Kalendhula, Shadowsun identified the attackers as the Death Guard. The Nexus could not fall to these monsters. The Death Guard could not be allowed to enter it and attack the main Tau Empire. Upon arrival at the Nexus, Shadowsun's fleet broke down into small battle groups, each with dedicated targets and responsibilities. Some relieved beleaguered defense stations, while others engaged the Death Guard fleet head-on. Every action was part of detailed, overlapping plans to present so many targets to the Death Guard that their fleet would fracture. Battle groups taunted and baited, retreating then striking again. So this continued. But the casualties mounted at an enormous rate. Though the number of putrid Death Guard wrecks began to grow, it was not enough to stop them. Scores of vessels still made to enter the Nexus. In a rare moment of doubt, Shadowsun considered that it might not be possible to win, and ordered for the Empire to be warned. In a blaze of light, an advanced prototype messenger drone sped from Shadowsun's command ship past the Death Guard fleet and into the Startide Nexus. As some of the Death Guard ships burrowed into their Nexus, those left behind suddenly withdrew from battle, their pestilential hulls absorbing terrific punishment as they made for a warp jump point. Vengeful Tau destroyed some, but a great many escaped, peeling away from the fields of fetid wrecks like a bandage drawn back from a still-seeping wound. On the other side of the Nexus in the Zone of Silence, the Starstrike defense fleets waited with bated breath. Reinforcements had been pulled in from across the Empire following the warning carried by the drone. But nothing happened. No foul plague ships emerged from the Nexus. For months the tower operated at the highest level of readiness, but there was nothing. The waiting was almost worse than battle. Such was the tension. At any point horrific forces could appear and submerge the Zone of Silence in a deluge of virulence. To what end the Death Guard's destructive attack had been launched, theories abounded. Tau strategists had no way of knowing whether this end had even been achieved, but all agreed the threat persisted. The Nexus's permanent defenses were increased, and battlefield data was scrutinized for answers. The Chalath expanse, home to the Nemyar Atoll, was riven by conflict. Tau fleets discovered Imperial worlds in the grip of civil war and mass civilian uprisings. Bringing the systems of this region into the greater good would require immense resolve and discipline. Shadowsun was confident that her warriors were capable. The humans of the Chalath expanse had been beset by disaster after disaster. First, the emergence of the Great Rift, accompanied by Tau overtures and invasions, and secondly, the Genestealer cult uprisings. Instances of mutation and seditious witchery increased, and governors and ruling councils bickered over which of these blights were causes and which were symptoms as they fought to retain control. Not one system avoided conflict. Shadowsun herself attacked Storias in the Thaxarel system. The Ctesippus and Arijan systems were not directly assaulted by Tau forces. They were subject to Genestealer cult uprising so successful that more than half of their key worlds fell in a matter of months. Those few that remained loyal held on by a thread, their enduring faith in the Emperor all that gave them strength. The defenders of Hairfoss were embroiled in an intense guerrilla war with Xenos cultists, complicated by murderous Tau infiltrations and their duplicitous diplomats. The Ryatov system became an inferno of bloodshed between the Tau, Astra Militarum and Genestealer cultists. The inhabitants of Vorothian in the Barolier system counted themselves fortunate for some time, before cursing their luck when the first forays of Tau encroachment triggered a mass uprising from long-forgotten parts of the Underhive in their capital. The Tau's core strategy remained the same, as with any sphere of expansion. The disenfranchised human populations were wooed with tales of the wonder of the greater good. Insurrectionist cells were cultivated and ambitious leaders supported. Still, the Tau never expected to contend with the Genestealer cults. When battlefield data was accumulated and autopsies were carried out on the corpses of strangely mutated humans, the horrible truth was revealed. They discovered monstrous hybrids of human and Tyranid genetic strands. Debate raged among the Earth caste as to how this was possible, but all agreed that these creatures had to be destroyed with extreme prejudice. The Tau were quick to take advantage of the pandemonium of the wars already raging between Imperial forces and the Genestealer cults, but it was not just the presence of human Tyranid hybrids that surprised them. Givasa auxiliaries talked of miracles that often occurred around the Imperium's priest caste, defying any scientific understanding. The reports told of strange anomalies of human behavior. Sometimes outbursts of violent insanity even occurred amongst the Givasa themselves. Meanwhile, strange portents were seen by the Chalath Expanse's Genestealer cults. Many expected the arrival of the Star Child to be heralded by a great veil of shadow and silence, according to their scripture and founding legends. When their leaders observed an increase in human psychic potential on their worlds, and a rising number of their own Maguses being born, they were concerned. For many, these omens meant one thing: the Star Child deemed them unworthy, and they would have to fight all the harder for their deity's attention and blessings. With the Imperials clinging harder to their own oppressive faith, and the Tau invaders' false creed of the greater good capturing the minds of countless humans, many Genestealer cults rose up in the name of the Star Children they so revered and worshipped. They would assert the strength of their deities, and in doing so, prove their own worthiness. Some even saw the increased number of Maguses as a positive sign, a weapon given to them by the Star Child to destroy their enemies. In the eyes of the Imperium, the Xenos threatened the very souls of the people. The great cathedra of the Ministorum sent out their priests far and wide, believing that only unshakable faith could see mankind through this most severe of tests. The knowledge that the Emperor protects reassured all, from the lowest factory menial to the greatest planetary lord. The Emperor had seen them safe for thousands of years, through great trials and turbulent times, and he would see them safe through this one too. Or so the gilded vox horns in every Hab-block manufactorum and basilica blared. No, that can't be right. Could you play it again, please? The bridge of the Tau warship Glimmer Star was only dimly lit, most of the crew off duty, and only 2 Tau huddled around a holographic projector discreetly built into a white panel. One of them was Oyeldinar, known to his subordinates as Silverwing. The other Tau was his communications officer, Pur-Ui Vaskar. She glanced at her commander for a moment and nodded, working the input panels of the communication station to restart the message they had just received from a battered, lonely interstellar drone. Once more, Commander Shadowsun appeared as a transparent hologram, seemingly directing her words to the 2 watching Tau as she spoke to a messenger drone. She seemed tired, and her voice lacked its usual confidence. "This is Oshesera speaking. I hope this message arrives in time for you to be warned, in time for you to act. We successfully traversed the star-tied nexus and established contact with our lost brothers and sisters of the 4th sphere. As suspected, they had suffered a failure of their AL-38 slipstream modules, but we don't understand exactly what happened yet. For your reference, I have attached the recordings of their surveillance drones. Most of the material was far too corrupted to gain useful information. Segments that were not, well, see for yourselves." As Oyeldinar and Uivashka watched on, the hologram changed to show images from the inside of a Tau ship. Despite having already seen the whole message, Oyeldinar swallowed hard and averted his eyes for a moment. He did not desire to see the torn and ravaged corpses of the settlers again, the splattered blood on the walls, the terror in their dead eyes. These brave colonists entered the wormhole of the Starstride Nexus in search of new worlds to spread the teachings of the greater good, Shadowsun's voice continued, as the hologram switched back to her. But they found only death. The few survivors, they have changed. As soon as they laid eyes upon our unfamiliar auxiliary troops, they reacted with open animosity. There is no trace of their own. Investigations are still ongoing, but none of the 4th Sphere survivors are willing to speak of the events before our arrival. Shadowsun paused for a moment and listened to some indiscernible words from outside of the field of view of the hologram. She nodded before she went on. I have to make this short. Despite the traumatic events our brothers and sisters of the 4th Sphere fleets have suffered through, as soon as reunited, we began the expansion of the 5th Sphere in earnest. Soon, we established new colonies on worlds. We wrestled from the grip of Bigel, Guela, and Yaha. However, each time we met the Guela in combat, the survivors of the 4th Sphere committed atrocities far beyond every necessity of war. It was problematic. Unfortunately, further interrogations into the cause of these troubling actions had to wait. We have recently come under attack by a new foe. Our enemies seem to be Guela nature, but nothing like we have encountered before. The face of the famous Tau commander looked haunted for a moment. They called themselves the Death Guard, and we have learned that they do so rightfully. The hologram now showed a group of warriors, clad in heavy armor, advancing through thick fog. They looked not unlike the Geransha, the Space Marines, but they seemed bloated and repulsive. As Olyedinar and Uivaskar watched, they opened fire with their primitive bolters, gunning down a group of Guevasa. Every booming shot they fired somehow sounded wet. Inexorably, the warriors advanced, crunching stones and corpses underneath their mutated feet. The Imperium may shun the teachings of the greater good. They may be primitive and barbaric, Shadowsun continued, but these humans are not part of the Imperium. They are worse. In congenital greed for power that plagues all their kind, they formed a terrible alliance. The hologram switched to show a revolting mound of putrid flesh with a grinning face and splintered horns. Immediately, the quality of the picture dropped noticeably. The creature swung a rusty blade and cut a crisis battlesuit in half. Another Shasui attacked with his burst cannons. The blubbering skin of the monstrous figure caved in, only to reveal a horde of smaller beasts, cackling and spilling forth to bury the tower underneath their mass. The Shasui screamed, but his voice did not come from the speakers. It seemed to be resounding everywhere on the Glimmer Stars bridge at once. The lights flickered, and the hologram abruptly vanished. The scream seemed to linger for a moment. Oyeldinar and Uivaska looked at each other and said nothing. A similar thing had happened the first time they had watched the message. But the screams of the dying were somehow different this time. It almost seemed as if they were closer. Neither of them understood, and neither of them dared to try. Moments later, the hologram came back to life as if nothing had happened. It now showed a sparkling reddish nebula between flickering stars. When Oyeldinar looked up, he could see a similar off-putting nebula outside the iron-shielded and reinforced cupola of the Glimmer Stars bridge. Similar, yet far away from where the message had been recorded. It was the Starstride Nexus. Commander Silverwing and his fleet were part of the heavily armed Tau garrison on this side of it, the Zone of Silence. The message had come from the other side. With all of the information he had about the Nexus, Oyeldinar wondered how the messenger drone had even survived the dangerous crossing. The hologram now showed a Tau fleet coming into view. By the look of it, the ships had been through several engagements showing scorch marks and improvised repairs. These Gwalar cannot be reasoned or bargained with, Shadowsun's voice returned, even less so than the rest of their kin. In the same way the Gwalar of the Imperium adhere to their emperor, these monstrous aliens have turned to the savage worship of a being called Nurghel. It seems they fell victim to a host of maladies while simultaneously developing a strange resistance against them, becoming dangerous vectors, which must be stopped at all costs. Nurghel? Whispered Uivaska. Again the bright light of the Glimmer Star flickered. Oyeldinar tried to ignore it. In the past 3 Vecta, our troops have met this dangerous foe in numerous engagements, Shadowsun continued in the hologram. The warriors of the Death Guard have attacked us on multiple front lines. They are extremely resilient. We are outnumbered, and we are outgunned. Oyeldinar shook his head in silence as he watched the message. Impossible. This seemed like a desperate acknowledgement of a superior foe. I hope this message arrives in time for you to be warned. These were the words Shadowsun had begun with, a warning. Thus, Commander Shadowsun spoke on. I have come to a decision. We cannot stop the Death Guard this side of the Starstride Nexus. After dozens of battles, our fleets are too damaged. Our strength is depleted to a point that we cannot halt this incursion any longer. If we still want to secure the expansion of the Nemya Atoll, we are now forced to choose, and we choose the latter. We are trusted in you, our comrades beyond the Nexus, to counteract the Death Guard threat. With these words, the hologram changed to once again show an outside view. In front of the deep galactic wound of the Starstride Nexus, the fleet of Tau warships were approaching an armada of crude vessels. Even by human standards, these ships seemed primitive and outdated to Oyeldinar. But that was the most disquieting thing about them. Far worse were the malignant fleshy growths that covered the ships in a wholly perverted and unnatural fashion. Porous flesh boils suppurated pus like matter into the void. Disgustingly bloated eyes the size of orca dropships blinked lazily at the oncoming Tau fleet, and enormous tentacles swayed like seaweed. The most terrifying thing of all, though, was the sheer size of the fleet, which outnumbered the Tau by far. As I record this message, Shadowsun said, we are closing in for a final engagement with the enemy's main fleet. The hologram returned to Shadowsun as she paused and checked a series of screens and data. Projections are grim, but we shall do as much damage as we can before withdrawing. I will help you in this way, but I cannot allow my forces to deplete beyond a point where I risk my own campaign. Even now, I fear I could risk too much, but it is for the greater good. I showed you what we face, what you will have to face. It might be against the teachings of Puretide for us to intervene one last time, but it is the least we... Suddenly, the hologram flickered and Shadowsun looked at something outside the picture. Damage report. Shield generators compromised. An artificial voice droned in the background. We have lost back Squall and Ivory. Another voice reported from elsewhere. Shadowsun closed her eyes for a split second before readdressing the drone. I have even less time than I anticipated, she said with more urgency than before. We are certain that the Death Guard aim to cross the Startide Nexus. We will try to stall them as long as we can, but we cannot stop them. The hologram flickered again as Shadowsun's ship was hit. Oyeldinar wondered if the commander had survived the engagement, or if he was witnessing her final words. I can only hope this drone arrives at the Zone of Silence intact, Shadowsun went on, and that we can hold the enemy at bay long enough for you to prepare yourselves for their coming. Tide Strike and Zephyr Bond reporting boarding parties, someone from outside the field of view said. Moon's Heart reporting several hits with some of... Moon's Heart, please repeat. Some sort of mucus-ridden energy beam. Corrosion damage on multiple decks. Shadowsun nodded in acknowledgement. Moon's Heart, disengage and retreat. All available crew, prepare countermeasures on Tide Strike and Zephyr Bond. All Corel, maintain attack pattern. The picture shook once more as the Clarity Blade, Shadowsun's own flagship, took a heavy hit, and the commander reeled for a second before she could steady herself. All disposable energy to the front shield generators, Shadowsun commanded. Watch out for that unidentified object on our flank. She glanced at the messenger drone for the last time. The tiredness had vanished from her eyes, replaced by the determination of a true Tau commander. End recording, she said. All ships, prepare for K-on maneuver and... The hologram abruptly cut to nothing. Aboard the Glimmer Star, Oyeldinar and Uivaska looked at each other, then up at the void outside their warship. It was empty, apart from their own fleet and the heavily armed space stations of the Tau Empire guarding this side of the Startide Nexus. When was this message recorded? Oyeldinar asked. Uivaska indicated to the time stamp. There is no way of mistaking it, Commander. Oyeldinar shook his head. This cannot be right. If it was correct, then the enemy fleet would have arrived by now. Maybe Shadowsun defeated the Gwalar after all, Uivaska suggested. There is simply no way they could have stopped a fleet of that size. Stalled? Yes. Defeated? Not even Shadowsun could do it. Oyeldinar looked warily up at the stars, as if anticipating the appearance of a virulent fleet at any given second. Consider the sheer extent of the Startide Nexus. She simply hasn't enough ships to stop every enemy vessel from entering. We have recently detected growing distortions in the Nexus, Commander. Maybe the enemy fleet was destroyed on its way here, Uivaska offered, in the same way as the Fourth Sphere expansion fleet. Or maybe the alliance of the Gwalar and their associates has ended and this near gale has attacked them. Too uncertain, Commander said curtly. What if there was some kind of temporal distortion? What if the enemy fleet knows a way out of the Nexus that we don't? Uivaska couldn't answer his questions and stayed silent. We have to account for Shadowsun's warning. We have to be prepared. Fleets do not simply vanish, Oyeldinar said. Together, they stared out into the void which remained unsettlingly empty. The Raising of Storias. The Imperial Cardinal World of Storias was celebrated across the sector for its magnificent architecture, incredible wealth, and priceless relics. When the planet's unshakable devotion to the Emperor saw its leaders reject the Tau's overtures without hesitation, Commander Shadowsun herself led the resulting assault. The severed heads of the Tau delegation were sent to meet Storias' leadership, presented to Shadowsun in 5 large gilded chests lined with plush red velvet, one for each caste. The humans had shown that they knew the difference between the castes, that they had listened to the Tau delegates and murderously rejected them all the same. The death of the Ethereal in particular made Shadowsun's blood boil. She resolved that an example must be made of these Gwelar. Such an act would surely bring others into the fold of the Tova more peacefully. Shadowsun took solace in the fact that countless more diplomatic efforts were being made all over Kishval, the tower's name for Storias. Hundreds of watercast agents met in secret with middle-ranking laymen across the planet. They learned that the united front presented by Storias' governing body was in fact a thin veneer that concealed the world's highly fractious politics. Every family had aspirations, fears, rivals and enemies, all exploitable by the Tau. In some places the Tau formed agreements, promising positions of influence after the planet's fall in exchange for alliance. In others, Tau troops trained in clandestine warfare launched raids against specific targets, the goal to make attacks resemble those of rival factions. Insurrectionists were encouraged and armed. Intelligence was gathered, constantly feeding data into Shadowsun's growing picture of a future battlescape. Some reports were more disturbing and unexpected. Deep in crypts, tunnels and other hidden areas, Tau reconnaissance elements found strange graffiti depicting worms or serpents. Some even recorded sightings of multi-limbed creatures scurrying away into the darkness. At this stage none could say with certainty that what these beings were, though the Tau were aware that weakness in human genetics sometimes led to ugly mutations and freak births. In keeping with her mastery of Kaon, the art of patient hunter, Shadowsun did not launch her assault on Storias for months. She knew that the more undermined and fractured the planet's leadership was, the swifter her campaign would be overall. By the time Tau dropships launched in their thousands, Storias was on the brink of civil war. Such were Shadowsun's preparations that not even alien conquest was threat enough to bring Storias' conflicting factions together. Nonetheless, those intending to resist readied themselves. All over Storias, the vast cathedral cities that made up the bulk of its inhabited areas revealed their capabilities. Gilded domes opened like blossoming flowers to reveal banks of anti-air cannons. Panes of stained glass windows, hundreds of meters long, slid into frames to unveil huge hangar bays filled with swift fighter craft. Processions of robe-clad monks took to the streets and barracks, whipping up crowds of people and ranks of soldiers into frenzies of hatred for their alien. The Tau made no direct assaults against the formidable defences, seeing such a strategy as a waste of lives and resources. Instead, their warriors were deployed in those urban districts deemed friendly following the watercast campaigns, or in the vast open spaces that were maintained as pleasure gardens, game parks, or simply left wild. Nevertheless, the Tau contingents moved into battle swiftly, determined to bring the fight for Kishval to a swift conclusion. Armoured interdiction cadres duelled Astra Militarum armoured companies in the Sagittarian fields, hammerheads picking off Lehman Russ battle tanks with their devastating railguns. The urban sprawl of Belenok was stalked by roving tribes of Kroot, working in tandem with breacher cadres, their task to root out hunkered-down human infantry that had created a veritable fortress of razor-wire weapon pits and bunkers. Kroot carnivores used their keen hunting senses to discover well-concealed Gwelar soldiers, while breacher teams employed their advanced close-quarters training to destroy human positions with their pulse blasters. Battles played out across the world as the Tau upkept a constant stream of hit-and-run attacks. Shadowsun desired to demonstrate the Tau's military superiority by defeating as many of the fanatical enemy as possible to force surrender without giving the Imperium anything like a solid victory of its own. But that surrender never came. Human resistance was dogged, their belief in their Emperor especially strong. Shadowsun was particularly troubled by accounts of miracles, as the Gevasa human prisoners described them. Some told of blinding light that obscured the charges of hundreds of human troops before they smashed into fire warrior lines. Others were barely credible tales of priest types flying through the air with vicious chain blades to carve through battlesuits in mid-flight. Whatever the reports, none conformed to the physical laws as the Tau understood them, yet drone-recorded battle footage showed such events occurring. So persuasive were some of these events that elements of the Gevasa turned on their Tau allies, screaming their repentance as they opened fire on those they had called comrades only minutes before. Frequent breakouts of insanity occurred in the Tau ranks, of the same kind the Tau had encountered after the Vow of Hope emerged. As before, these were confined to humans and other non-Tau species, and were swiftly concealed by the Tau hierarchy. Any Tau discovered referring to strange aliens stepping out of the ruined corpses of insane humans were quarantined and dispatched to special hospitals for recovery. When a detachment of 4th Sphere Tau was discovered by the 5th Sphere allies killing prisoners, including humans who had already embraced the greater good, its commander stated that one day the rest of the Empire would thank him before he took the Malklar. As the fighting raged on all over Storias, Shadowsun looked keenly for a crucial weakness that she could capitalize on to bring the bloody war to an end. The humans' morale was strong, stronger than she had ever seen elsewhere. They held to their beliefs with a vigor that almost defied imagination. Their faith was their life. It was their greatest strength. Could that make it their greatest weakness? Gathered intelligence indicated that the humans fought hard over sites and artifacts of particular religious significance, that if these fell or were captured, acts of individual surrender spiked. When human propaganda boasted that not a single cathedral city had fallen, Shadowsun knew her next move. She would topple the planet's greatest cathedral city, Aglos or Magna. The capture of such a place would surely cripple the resolve of the staunchest human defenders. They would know their emperor was not with them when the broadcast filled with Tau declarations of victory and peace offerings to those humans that still resisted began in earnest. Shadowsun's forces made to surround Aglos or Magna. Potential human relief forces were subject to relentless assault as Riptide and Ghostkill battlesuits ambushed armoured columns, and innumerable swarms of drones were deployed to harass infantry forces. Tau contingents surrounding the cathedral city were under strict orders from Shadowsun to leave clear a passage outwards. She could not rest the defenders believing that they had no option but a fight to the death. Escape had to be seen as a real possibility for them, though Shadowsun's forces were secretly placed to kill or capture any that actually attempted to break out. The Tau intercepted and hacked all human communications and broadcast demands to surrender. Those that handed themselves over, they declared, would be offered food, water and safety. Not one Gwalar capitulated. Advanced infiltration cadres made the first forays into Aglos or Magna, striking from all directions. They expected fierce resistance from the outset, their only mission to identify defensive emplacements and mark them out for destruction. However, they were actually able to advance several kilometers into the city, past abandoned defensive cannons and bunkers. They did not know why the Gwalar had yielded these positions, and Shadowsun cautiously ordered her follow-up contingents to begin securing them, so that they could not be reoccupied by the humans. Hundreds of fire warrior teams tactically advanced from gilded column to gilded column, through small chapels, accommodation for menials, and enormous basilicas large enough to house dozens of armoured vehicles. Shadowsun believed that the absence of defenders could only mean a trap, so the advanced cadres were ordered to take deliberate care. In spite of herself, Shadowsun looked forward to the humans' efforts to attack her well-trained warriors, and to seeing them fail. But she underestimated her opposition. Hundreds of unsuspecting fire warriors were killed when parts of ceiling frescoes were peeled away to reveal murder holes through which the defenders dropped explosives and grenades. Trapdoors large enough to swallow storm surges opened up beneath the advancing Tau forces. Those unfortunate to fall through were butchered by zealots, or destroyed by the autocannons and lascannons of waiting heavy weapons teams. And so began months of guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency actions. Carrion and Montcar strategies were carried out at squad level. The humans knew every secret passage of their cathedral city, using them to their immense advantage, and in doing so claiming countless Tau lives. The Tau drew the defenders into ambushes and kill zones of their own, utilizing the secret passageway network themselves where they discovered it, or deliberately threatening certain artifacts or shrines to draw out Aglos or Magna's rogue defenders. As casualties mounted, Shadowsun refused to overcommit her forces in all-out assault. To do so would be to throw away lives. And as the noose of Tau forces tightened around the defenders, surrenders seemed inevitable. But no surrender came. Shadowsun also had to withdraw her Gavasa forces, whose brutality towards the defenders had grown to heights she could not tolerate. Torture of prisoners and mutilation of the dead were common. Some Gavasa openly wore jewelry made from the extracted teeth of dead Storians. They frequently disobeyed orders to hold position, instead pursuing retreating foes, making themselves and others vulnerable in the process. Strange anomalies and sanity outbreaks became more frequent where humans fought other humans. Despite all this, the Tau were winning. More territory was secured with each passing day as the defenders' numbers depleted and their supplies ran low. The desperation of Shadowsun's enemies was finally revealed when thousands of them launched an overwhelming attack to break out. They were nearly successful, such was the surprise they achieved. Thundering companies of battle tanks and tens of thousands of zealous troops came perilously close to overrunning the city's western districts. It was only thanks to Tau discipline and the careful redeployment of rapid response cadres full of crisis battlesuits and devilfish-mounted fire warrior teams that the attack was stymied. The failure of this assault broke the defenders' back. Such were the resources required to launch it, and finally, pockets of emaciated and terrified humans began to surrender. The pace of the Tau's advance soon quickened, and the noose tightened completely. Shadowsun herself took the field in the final battles of the conflict, as the last of Aglos Magna's starving humans surrendered or were cut down. Her twin fusion blasters incinerated countless defenders, melting through scores of bunkers. Shadowsun's victory at Aglos Magna was projected all over Keshval. The glory of the Tauvar shone for all to see. The ethereals of the Fifth Sphere smiled, knowing that surely this spelled the end of human resistance on the planet. Watercast aides prepared victory speeches, but the move was premature. Seeing the mighty spheres of Aglos Magna topple to the ground and shatter into millions of pieces had simply stiffened the resolve of those who still fought. With sadness, Shadowsun had little choice but to accept that much blood was still to be spilled, though humanity's suicidal drive to fight regardless of casualties made her shudder. After the battle's conclusion, Commander Shadowsun walked the ward of Hospital Ship 227. So many of these vessels had been constructed since the Damocles Crusade that the Tau had ceased naming them. Shadowsun had come unannounced, dressed in simple robes. Bunk after bunk was filled with wounded and dying Tau. Many had lost limbs, while others were held down with tight restraints, driven mad by horror. Earth-caste orderlies rushed past bearing medicines and surgical equipment, so busy that they failed to notice that Shadowsun herself walked amongst them. Each hospital ship had capacity for around 5,000 wounded. Every one of the dozens in Storias' orbit were operating well beyond those limits. Shadowsun saw the dead jettisoned from airlocks in their hundreds. They would normally have been burned in honorable funeral ceremonies, but such were their numbers and the demand for space that there was simply no time to observe tradition. The commander knew that not one of the fallen would begrudge this necessity. None of it mattered so long as it was done for the greater good. Battle still raged on Storias, and Shadowsun would not let their sacrifice be in vain.